welcome back to Next Level Trade, or welcome if this is your first time with us. My name is David Thacker. I'm the Director of Strategic Engagement at Kansas Global, and we're once again really excited and thrilled to bring this show or event to you today. Like last time, I've got 3 housekeeping events. First, the webinar is recorded and will be sent to you because you registered. So if you missed something, if you want to go back for something, if you'd like to share it, rewatch it, it will be coming in an email. Second, we do have a tight schedule. We're trying to keep it right at 30 minutes. That's one of the features of the show. So all Q&A, send them into the Q&A chat. We do have a dedicated staff person who's going to be bringing all those in, and then we'll be working on individual follow-up. So rather than encumber this 30 minutes with trying to answer everyone's questions, we'll do that individually with follow-up, and I'll work with Karyn on that. And then lastly, this is the second event of our pilot series. And so your feedback, comments, improvements, suggestions, snarks, and compliments are very, very welcome. We actually have gotten some from the first event last week that we've implemented into today's event. So you have ideas for how to make it better, what could be improved, or what you enjoyed and don't want to see go away, let us know either by email or with the survey at the end. We'll make sure to try and keep this really, really valuable. With that being said, let's kick it off and let's get rolling. Our subject today is trade policy, and I'm joined by Karyn Page, my CEO, president, my boss, mentor, and one who I have a very great privilege to call a good friend. Karyn, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, David. I'm glad to be here. You know, I'm always up for a trade policy conversation, especially with so many changes on the front.
Right, and there are so many changes, and there are a lot of conversations being had. So to give us, to lay the foundation of what we're talking about, and hopefully bring it to some kind of a practical value for people on the meeting today, what is trade policy, and why does it affect so many people?
So let's start out by first saying who has the authority to initiate trade policy. So by law, by U.S. law, it's actually the president, actually the Congress, who has the authority to negotiate trade deals. They then delegate that authority to the president, who then assigns or delegates the authority to USTR. There's been some changes in trade law that really define that. But when we say USTR or U.S. Trade Representative, that's the person who has the full responsibility. And they work with a team of specialists who have very detailed expertise in agriculture or a country or a region. So that's the first thing, is who has the authority to negotiate trade. The second that I would mention to you is the purpose of trade policy in general is to open or close national markets. And that is, prevalent throughout the world. And really why we're doing that is to either keep out someone from our market in the U.S., for example, or offer to our exporters more market access in other countries, make it more competitive for them because you establish rules whereby everyone plays. An important thing to note here is that when you have a comprehensive free trade agreement or even a lesser trade agreement, they are most often enforceable. And that really helps with everyone staying on the same page and our ability to compete.
So what it comes down to is that the policy is created to help U.S. producers, U.S. businesses compete in the global arena.
Yes, absolutely. That's the whole point.
And how can policy do that? How can that happen? So what are some examples of actions that can be taken to make U.S. companies more competitive or less competitive?
Well, I think a prominent one that makes our companies less competitive are tariff actions. So we've seen that a lot during the Trump administration the last 4 years, where we saw Section 232 tariffs on imported aluminum and steel, Section 301 tariffs on imports from China. And how does that make someone not competitive? Well, 2 ways. The first is when you're charged a tax, when tariff is a tax, on your items that you use in your manufacturing, that you're buying in your supply chain, it's going to increase your costs. which makes you less competitive with folks in other countries in the world if you're selling those as an exporter. The second thing it does is that it gives ammunition to other countries to issue retaliatory tariffs, which we've also seen in many cases. So it's really eroding competitive ability for U.S. companies. A tool that makes it more helpful are free trade agreements. So I'll just mention the USMCA or NAFTA 2.0 as I still think of it. It really is establishing the rules for fair trade amongst the companies and producers within the nations of Canada, US, and Mexico. And one of the most prominent features of a free trade agreement is that it lowers tariffs across the board, and the goal is actually to reduce tariffs to zero.
You shared this with me from the Tax Foundation, talking about the most recent tariffs in the last 3 or 4 years, that if all the tariffs announced by the U.S. and other nations were fully imposed, U.S. GDP would fall by 0.51%, over $125 billion. In the long run, wages would fall by 0.35%, and employment would fall by nearly 400,000. And yet, tariffs are often justified by saying they're protecting U.S. industries. Why is it that the opposite effect often happens from what is stated?
Well, my belief is that when we're looking at protectionist measures, there's really very few cases where a tariff will actually protect an industry. It could be a new industry, a new industry that's being born, for example, that needs some protection. But the reason that it doesn't really work is that we're all connected globally. The whole point of global trade is that we each can perform and produce and sell the stuff that we're best at, that we're the most efficient at producing. And when we add tariffs into the mix, it just increases cost. And because we don't do it all ourselves inside a bubble, right? It's all globally connected. Really what happens is a negative impact. And another interesting thing is, and this was produced by the Tax Foundation actually late last year, so it doesn't even include any impact of COVID-19 in their estimation. But another interesting fact is you look back in history, and I cannot find any instance of a tariff that didn't have a negative economic impact. Now, one thing to note is that when you look at tariffs and trade policy in general, that the negative impact usually affects more people prominently than the generals. And the positive impact is really dispersed across a large swath of industry and folks. So when you see that negative impact come, it really hurts a lot to certain groups or industries of people. In the case of the tariffs of the Trump administration, we're seeing actually much broader impact, which is, I think it's resulting in challenges for our companies. In particular, really disproportionately affects small businesses, just because small businesses have less bandwidth to deal with this. They don't necessarily have government relations for people to fight for them in DC or to work with a team of specialty lawyers to help them combat this. So that's one of the greatest concerns that I have, is that although tariffs affect all businesses, it really, really harms small businesses. Conversely, free trade agreements and trade tools give small businesses a really nice playing field and really give them a chance to compete globally through the through the trade tool, but also because then they can be like the big guys, right? This is a tool that's available to everyone.
Now, we'll get to the Biden administration in just a few moments, but while we're on the subject of tariffs, what do you expect will happen with the tariffs put on by the Trump administration in the last 4 years as Biden comes into office? They're not going to immediately go away. Is there a timeline? Is there something that we could look forward to in terms of relief from some of the actions, and then even what the response will be from trading partners on some of the retaliatory tariffs that have been levied on us?
Well, that's a really good question. And I think it's something that we're all maybe hoping will be, resolved. there's a lot of speculation. But as I said earlier, it's really up to the president and USTR. So Biden has named USTR, U.S. Department of Commerce Secretary, as well as U.S. Department of Agriculture Secretary that he intends to nominate. They've put their names forward. So first we have to get them, confirmed, or get the point persons confirmed. And then we'll have to see what the president's trade agenda is, and see what he's going to do. There's been a lot of speculation about what's going to happen. I can give you my guess. It is in alignment with other analysts, but really it's just a guess. So I think that we can continue to see China tariffs. I think that Biden may take a different approach. He said publicly, he's going to continue to stick to a tough agenda on China, but that he's already reached out to some of the U.S. allies to see if we can have a more collaborative approach to combat this together, or combat China together. One thing that you should know, and our listeners should know, is that the president is required to do a trade agenda. This year, we can look for that to be announced. It's due on February 28th, so the 1st of March, and it will lay out the president's trade agenda. That's as an annual occurrence, so we can expect this to be a nice indicator. Another thing that we should talk about is that I mentioned that they have to be confirmed, and usually it takes several months for that to occur. So everyone, be patient. Hold your horses. Have to get the administration fully in place and operational before we can kind of see what's happening. We are keeping track of, what folks are saying. Commerce Secretary Raimondo has, done some talking, as well as USTR, meeting with some folks in industry and industry sectors, including the agriculture. So it gives us a little glimpse about, maybe what their positions are going to be.
So switching gears, if tariffs are the supposed defensive actions we can take to try to defend against unfair play or to protect industries, you've mentioned and you've used the term that free trade agreements are offense. They're the actions we can positively take to try to create a better playing field. Can you explain why you use that term and what it means?
So when I say a free trade agreement is our offense, this is a intentionally negotiated, targeted contract between two nations, or three nations in the case of NAFTA, or more nations in the case of the Trans-Pacific Partnership that the U.S. is now not a part of. And what it does is it really lays out the ground rules. And when we have the rules, and I think everyone can agree, if we have the rules, we can figure out how to play. And so this is really why it's an offensive play. It really helps us understand where there might be places we can push, gaps we can fill. And then when we're looking at the markets that are included in those free trade agreements, it allows us to compete more fairly in those markets against other folks that are from other nations. So that's really why it's an offense play. The third reason, and the most important, that really speaks to practical implications of free trade agreements, is that participation in a free trade agreement is completely voluntary by a U.S. company. It is their choice to determine if this is something that will be helpful to them and if they want to participate. So they can use this as part of their overall strategy for market entry and increased export sales in the countries that the U.S. has free trade agreements.
You also sent this over. If you look on the list of free trade agreements, U.S. is somewhere down there with only 20 compared to 64 with Singapore. We're not leading the pack when it comes to number of free trade agreements. Now, just to get out a devil's advocate argument, are we signing so many multilateral agreements that our 20 is worth Singapore's 64?
No.
Okay, so what does this mean in terms of competition and the ability of U.S. companies to compete against Canadian companies, let's say, in foreign markets, if Canada has free trade agreements, has lowered those tariffs and created a even and known playing field with 53 or sizably larger amount of countries and locations in the U.S.? How does that affect the small businesses trying to do business globally?
They're adversely impacted. So if a Kansas small business is trying to compete in Canada, because Canada has free trade agreements, and they have one with China, for example, just don't have one with the EU. I mean, the U.S. companies, our Kansas companies, are competing in Canada for market share, right, for sales, and they're competing on an unfair basis with, China or the EU. I mean, it's really it's really simple. A lot of folks tell me that trade policy is kind of complicated, and although I understand where they're coming from, it's not really. It's just about competition, and these contracts that the nations have really allow the companies that reside in those nations who have those contracts or free trade agreements to be more competitive. I want to point out something from this slide. Two things, actually. One is I actually put this together, staff put it together actually at the end of last year. And there's been some changes. I mean, they're not a whole bunch of changes, but I can tell you that there has been no additional trade agreements for the U.S., but some of the folks on the list have added trade agreements while we have not. The second thing is these are free trade agreements. These are the full-blown comprehensive trade agreements. And if you see the number on the list, like Singapore with 64 or Canada with 53, these are the free trade agreements themselves, a single agreement that may cover multiple markets. So for example, Japan is really the leader of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, now minus the U.S., has 10 countries, including Japan. So this is not countries on that right-hand side, but free trade agreements that could have more countries involved in them.
Right, and which is the reason for the question before, that it's not like the U.S. is having so many trade agreements, contracts with so many countries, that the 20 is a really robust number of actually 80 countries. Not only is our number small, but a lot of those agreements are bilateral, such as Morocco and Australia. And we have, of course, NAFTA, which is 2 countries. And that's been a strategy of the current outgoing administration. And so not only does our number of agreements pale in comparison to some other places, but the type of agreements doesn't help our case any. For example, the Canada, I believe they do have one with the EU. Is that correct?
Yep.
Which means that U.S. companies trying to sell into Europe are competing against Canadian companies who have lower tariff rates and organized rules of play. And the nations have agreed to try to foster trade between the EU and Canada, whereas there's no such formal contract with the U.S., which immediately puts U.S. companies at a disadvantage, correct?
Correct. Exactly.
All right. The next one you shared is here's what's going on now. So we have a handful of things. This is of course what's going on in the last 6 to 12 months. Where are we with perhaps the last 3? If people know that at USMCA is finalized, they're still going through some of the implementation and enforcement. What's happened with our agreements with China and Japan, and then what's up with UK, Kenya, India, and Brazil?
Well, this image, what it actually shows is starting on the left side of the screen, a done deal to, it goes lesser, in terms of formalization. So what's going on with the negotiations is that the UK has exited from the EU, so that now leaves us at least some certainty about continuing or finalizing our negotiations with a free trade agreement with UK. The issue there is that, will the UK have enough freedom and the desire to kind of go with a more US approach to trade as opposed to the EU approach to trade? So an example of an EU approach is in the agricultural world, EU really likes geographical indicators, or GIs. An example of that is champagne. So a product can only be called champagne if it's from the Champagne region of France, period. So if it's white wine with bubbles in it, it can't be called champagne unless it's from Champagne. So that's an example of that. And this is not a U.S. approach to things. I mean, champagne. Okay, I know that our friends in France would argue against that, but when we're talking about market access and global competitiveness, we want less barriers instead of more. In terms of Kenya, we continue to negotiate with Kenya, and how a negotiation works is that we start out with low-hanging fruit, right? So the negotiators on both sides or in the various countries that are involved in the deal, they start talking about both industry-focused as well as industry and sector, and then sort of discipline. So a discipline may mean, small business or, access to government contracts. And so they start out with the kind of high-level stuff. What can we all agree on, right? So that's actually what they do. What can we all agree on? And then they actually mark the text. They present text to each other, mark the text on where the issues are. And they set the issue areas aside. And then they kind of methodically go through and see how they can resolve and come to a conclusion. There's been mention of maybe something with India and with Brazil, although I can tell you that, at least from my view, there's been little going on with that. Now, all that said, this is what's been going on today or in the last 4 years with the Biden or with the Trump administration. Great, we're getting a new administration, as you've already indicated. So who knows if we'll continue? It's really up to President Biden.
So that was another question I had was, so any of the progress we've made with UK and Kenya, is that a reset now? Do we continue? What is lost and what is continued on, let's say in the case of UK and Kenya, since there's already work going on?
My experience in watching changes of administration in regard to trade policy is you have to wait and see. I know that's not a very satisfactory answer. So as I said earlier, we can kind of guess, where they might be heading, but we really won't know. And of course, it's not just the president or the USTR or the Secretary of Commerce or Ag. It's also Congress. So while the Biden administration may push something forward, it still has to all be approved and then, enacted by U.S. Congress. So honestly, we'll just have to wait and see. But there are some things I think that, I think you're going to ask me this next. I mean, this is what I'm thinking, is some practical tips. So I think when you look at the Biden administration, there's some things that you should keep an eye out for, even before we have the president's trade agenda or any, specific indicators. I think you should pay attention to climate change and environmental focus, which is going to be included in trade deals. So I can give an example from the Obama administration where they really coupled State Department, corporate diplomacy, and climate change with trade. And that was not a bad thing for folks in those industries. So if you're in that industry or you could make a play in those types of industries, I think you should really pay attention. I think another thing we're going to see is humanitarian and labor views really suffused in trade policy. And I don't want people to think that when I say that hasn't been the case with the current administration. It has been the case. In fact, USMCA has the strongest labor chapter I have ever seen in any free trade agreement. So it's not that, the Trump administration has ignored that. I don't want anyone to think that it's just not true. So I think we're going to see some of that thing. I think immigration is going to play into this conversation, even though that's not a direct fit with trade policy, but it certainly has an impact. And I think as well that we're going to see a willingness to look at multilateral deals as opposed to just unilateral. A difference between a multilateral, multi meaning more than one country. So NAFTA or USMCA is multilateral, has 3 countries. Bilat deals, or, you can think of it as unilat if you're from the US, it's just 2 countries like the US and Australia, as you mentioned.
Can you dive into the multilateral negotiation process? Because one might think, as in, if I was trying to create agreement with 3 friends, there's going to be a lot of compromises that happen, a lot more than if I was negotiating with one friend and I was in the position of power like the U.S., which could be a common misconception. But the reality is that the negotiations are still done very in a very detailed manner for each country, each industry, no matter how many countries are in the deal. Can you take a minute and just talk about that process?
Yes. So one of the things that I think that is misunderstood is the level of detail that negotiators dive into to come to an agreement. So I think the best way to explain that is a trade negotiator is not only a very skilled and very specialized international attorney, almost always, they have expertise in a particular industry or area. So for example, on USMCA, it wasn't just Canada, the US, and Mexico getting together and talking in some big room, although that is part of it. What happens actually is that the ag negotiators all get together. If there's an issue that they need to pull out, or for example, between US and Canada on dairy, which was an issue that was they made some resolution on, the Canadian and the US trade negotiators in ag on dairy actually get together and talk about what the issues are. Some of the mechanisms that are used are side letters and annexes. So they're actually side letters that become part of the larger trade agreement that address certain, issues. Like, for example, it could be, dairy between the U.S. and Canada, which not necessarily issue with Mexico. So I think that, maybe another way to explain it is all of the folks on the call have been in contract negotiations at one point or another in their careers, and you know how complicated that can be. So imagine 2 nations or 3 nations getting together. Every trade agreement, modern trade agreement, has at least 30 chapters, and there's a lot of detail in there. So it's really complicated, long agreement.
And a multilateral doesn't lose its poignancy or its power in terms of how it increases the competitiveness of U.S. companies. It doesn't lose that. It just adds more countries and more locations to this agreement while still calling out specific actions and agreements need to take place. For example, the dairy agreement between the U.S. and Canada, which is not the same between U.S. and Mexico, even though all 3 are in the same trade agreement.
Yes, that is my view of it. I think that, I'm not a black and white person or either or. So I think that we have to weigh risk versus reward. And in terms of multilateral versus bilateral agreements, I think that the potential benefit far outweighs any negotiation erosion that could occur from multiple nations. I mean, that's just a simple view of it. It's just, I think we get a lot more benefit than we lose, in negotiation with multiple countries. And we just get a lot more market access.
Right.
And I think it's more efficient. Okay, so we already were renegotiated Trans-Pacific Partnership during the Obama administration. And I will tell you that over 80% of the text for USMCA or NAFTA 2.0 was actually taken directly copied and pasted from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So why didn't we just add the other, 8 countries? That would have been awesome, right? More access for companies.
All right, we are running out of time. So how do producers stay informed? What should they be looking for? What can they do to try to take advantage and stay competitive?
Well, I put this together so that, there'd be something you all could take away. And you might be a little irritated with me because the first one is pay attention and don't assume. But here's the deal. Whenever I'm talking to folks on the Hill in Washington, D.C., what they say is we need to hear more from small businesses, right? They don't want to hear, they already hear from the U.S. Chamber or the big national, associations or even the, producer or ag related associations. And that's good. They rely on that. But they want to hear more from small business. They really want to hear how that impacts you. So you have to give that kind of input. You really have to pay attention to what's coming up. And then you really have to take action. So that can take the form of, inputting public comment when it's requested. You could testify on the Hill in DC. You could just let your senator or congressperson know. You could call me and I'll make sure it gets up the chain. So I think that is the one thing I would say is, just pay attention. You have to be aware in order to act and then act. They do want to hear from you. Your voice is really important and it's really valuable. The second thing I would say is, look at what your trade activities are today, and then make sure you are taking advantage of every free trade agreement that the U.S. has. Really take a look at it and analyze it. You may be leaving some money on the table, or you may be not taking advantage of a competitive situation that could really help you.
Perfect. Well, we are out of time. Thank you, Karyn, so much for being here. Thanks for your insights and expertise. And of course, if you have questions remaining afterwards, you can get in touch with us. We'll be happy to talk with you guys about anything. Again, this is the second invitation, so another shameless plug and request. Like last time, a 4-question survey is going to pop up. We got suggestions that we did implement in this event that came in from last event. So if you took 30 seconds, filled that out, that was really, really helpful for us last time. And we assume it'll be helpful again for us this time. Next week, I'm sitting down with Brett Silvers from World Business Capital. We're talking about global supply chain financing as well as export financing, one of the best in the business. Same time, Thursday at 1 p.m. You will not want to miss that. Check your email this afternoon and register before you forget. So thank you all for coming. Thank you all for joining us and for sticking to the end. Until next time, I'm David Thacker. This is Next Level Trade from Kansas Global.
Thanks, everyone. I look forward to hearing from you.